Lecture 4, The Deuteronomistic History.
Hello and welcome back to Lecture 4. In this lecture we're going to continue our examination of the Hebrew Bible by looking briefly at the book of Deuteronomy and then by focusing on the so-called Deuteronomistic History, a term which refers to Deuteronomy and to the books that follow it, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. The book of Deuteronomy, which ends the Torah, looks in two directions, in effect, back to Torah itself and forward to the second main section of the Hebrew Bible, the prophets, or Nevi'im. As the scholar Barry Albanster puts it, quote, Deuteronomy is the narrative bridge between the Torah and the prophets, close quote. Now, the section of the Bible called prophets is traditionally further subdivided into the former prophets and the latter prophets. The former prophets are the books we'll be talking about in this lecture: Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. The latter prophets, which we'll turn to in the next lecture, are the books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets. And in the next lecture, I'll talk about what prophecy means, what a prophet is. But in this lecture, I want to look at the former prophets, not in connection with the latter prophets, but in connection with Deuteronomy and as part of the Deuteronomistic history. The Deuteronomistic history is a term used to refer to the theory that the books of Deuteronomy through 2nd Kings form a unified whole, that they should be read in some sense as a unit, as a unified narrative. And the reason that scholars think this, the reason for reading these books as a unified narrative, is that Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings reflect throughout the theological viewpoint that is articulated in the book of Deuteronomy itself. So I want to begin by looking at Deuteronomy and talking about what kind of theological viewpoint it gives us as a bridge to the Deuteronomistic history. Now, as the closing book of the Torah, Deuteronomy narrates the end of Moses' life and leadership. The word Deuteronomy itself means second law. It comes from two Greek words meaning second and law, deuteros and nomos. And this refers to the assumption that within the text itself, Moses refines and amplifies the law he had presented earlier in the Torah. So that's why Deuteronomy is called second law. It also does much more than that, of course. Deuteronomy is an extremely complex book. It covers forms of religious worship, political institutions such as kingship and priesthood, legal statutes. There's a very great deal covered in this book. And throughout the book of Deuteronomy, there is an assumption that the people of Israel suffer or flourish depending on their obedience to God and their obedience to the covenant that Moses formed with God on their behalf, that Moses formed as the spokesman for the entire people of Israel. Now, I mentioned in the previous lecture the original covenant between Abraham and God, which established the descendants of Abraham as the chosen people of God. The covenant that Moses establishes with God, or perhaps I should say that God establishes with Moses, is a slightly different form of covenant. As presented in Deuteronomy, this covenant between God and the Israelite people seems pretty clearly to be modeled on an ancient Near Eastern treaty form, treaties of mutual obligation, which are often referred to as suzerain vassal treaties. A suzerain is a term meaning overlord, ruler, and a vassal, of course, is a subject or a subordinate. Now, in this form of treaty, which is attested in various ancient Near Eastern societies, the suzerain promises to protect the vassal in return for the vassal's loyalty and obedience. It is a treaty of mutual obligation and mutual benefit. And in this view of the covenant between God and Moses, or between God and the Jewish people, God as the suzerain promises to reward the Jewish people for good behavior and to punish them for bad behavior. The Ten Commandments themselves, as well as other elements of the covenant, can be seen as fitting into this suzerain vassal treaty model. It's a very fascinating topic, which, of course, as always, I don't have time to go into in detail. Once again, I'd refer you to the lectures of Professor Amy Jo Levine on this topic. But just very, very brief example, the first commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me, reflects the standard oath of loyalty and fidelity on the part of the vassal. Notice that God doesn't say there are no other gods. He says, thou shalt have no other gods before me. This is how this form of treaty would work. The suzerain would say, in effect, if you will ally yourself to me, if you will not choose to be the vassal of any one of those other overlords out there, but will ally yourself with me, I will protect you. I will give you benefits for doing so. And even the very opening words, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, reflect the opening of a suzerain vassal treaty in which the suzerain gives his titles and states his achievements. So this is a very interesting and I think very important way of looking at the covenant and the theological viewpoint that it implies in Deuteronomy, that the Jewish people will be rewarded for obeying the covenant, will be punished for disobeying the covenant. Now, the theory of the Deuteronomistic history, in its strongest form, posits that the book of Deuteronomy itself, at some point, was edited specifically to serve as an introduction to the next 4 books of the Bible. That Deuteronomy was reworked, was crafted in order to provide a fitting introduction to the discussion of the rulership of Israel under the judges and then later under the kings, under the monarchs. And this, what we might call the strong version of the theory of the Deuteronomistic history, further claims that these 5 books, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, counting 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings as one book each, the strong version of the Deuteronomistic history theory claims that these 5 books were compiled by a single editor, or at least by a single school. Just as in art we can talk of school of Michelangelo, meaning a painting done by a follower of Michelangelo, we can say that there are schools of literary work as well. Now, some scholars think that there are too many internal inconsistencies in this stretch of 5 books for us to say that we can see one editor's hand at work here. And so what we might call the weaker version of the Deuteronomistic history theory posits successive editions of this section of the Bible, beginning as early as the 7th century and continuing into the period of the Babylonian exile, which again is 586 through 538 BC. But whether these books represent the work of a single redactor or editor or of several editors over a period of a couple of centuries, the writer or perhaps writers of the Deuteronomistic history faced the task of explaining why, in the face of God's covenant with Israel, several events of history had happened as they did. First and foremost, why did the Israelites adopt monarchy as their form of government? Think about that for a moment. If God is their suzerain, if God is their ruler, why do they need another one? Why do they need a king? Why do they need a monarch? Where did that come from? Once the monarchy had been founded, why did the united monarchy, which was founded by Saul and reached its high point under David and Solomon, why did it divide into 2 parts, Israel in the north and Judah in the south? More troubling still, why was the northern kingdom conquered by the Assyrians in 722? And worst of all, why did the Babylonians succeed in subduing Judah and capturing Jerusalem itself in 586? So in the face of this treaty, this suzerain vassal treaty, the covenant under which God says he will protect the Hebrew people, why did these things happen as they did? Now, within the covenant as treaty framework established in Deuteronomy, the Deuteronomistic history portrays these events as the consequence of the vassal's disobedience to their overlord. We're not going to say that God fell down on his side of the covenant, right? So we're going to have to say it must have been the people, the chosen people, who failed to perform their obligations under this treaty model of the covenant. And so the various stories of different leaders, culminating in the establishment of the monarchy and the Davidic line, are all, in this reading of this section of the text, directed towards explaining the ultimate failure of and destruction of that monarchy, both after its division into 2 parts and before. This helps explain, I think, a certain discomfort with the very idea of monarchy that's obvious as early as 1 Samuel chapter 8. The people of Israel have asked Samuel, the prophet Samuel, to appoint a king for them. And 1 Samuel 8, verses 6 through 20 reads in part, The thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to govern us." Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Just as they have done to me from the day I brought them out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so also they are doing to you. Now then listen to their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them." So you see, God says, they have rejected me. They're asking for another king. They're falling down on their part of the bargain. So Samuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you." And then he goes through this list of horrifying abuses. He'll enslave your children. My favorite in the list of abuses is he will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. Terrible fate. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves, the best of your cattle and donkeys, and put them to his work. And it culminates with the Lord saying, "On that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you on that day." But the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel. They said, "No, we are determined to have a king over us, so that we also may be like other nations, and that our king may govern us and go out before us and fight our battles." This introduces the monarchy. And as I said, I think it's not an exaggeration to say that there is a real discomfort with the whole idea of monarchy present there. The people insist, and so Samuel in effect says, "Well, okay," and the monarchy begins. Now, I've been referring throughout this lecture, and will continue to the Deuteronomistic History, because that is the term that scholars use to refer to this segment of the Bible. But the term history, as applied to these books, must not mislead us into thinking that they follow modern standards of historiography. As Banstra puts it, the same scholar I quoted a few minutes ago, quote, "This material is not historiography in a social scientific sense, but then it does not pretend to be. It tells the story of the nation from the theological perspective that Israel prospered or suffered in relation to how obedient or disobedient they were to the covenant," close quote. And the Deuteronomistic history, and for that matter much of the rest of the Hebrew Bible, is as much a work of literature as of history. After all, that's why we're talking about it in a course on great authors of the Western literary, not historical tradition. I think, in fact, that appreciation of the full richness of this text almost requires close attention to its literary aspects as well as to its value for history. As I've already noted, the books of the Deuteronomistic history were written, or at least were edited, long after the events they describe. For instance, David ruled probably at the end of the 11th and beginning of the 10th century BC. The Deuteronomistic history was probably compiled in or around the 7th century, so there's a gap of several hundred years there. That means that the writers had to draw upon their own imaginations to describe characters and events, to give conversations, to say how and when and why things happened. Now, this by no means implies that the authors invented the stories out of whole cloth. But neither was the author or authors a mere recorder of facts. This isn't someone writing down history as it's happening. This is someone taking the traditional stories and reworking them centuries later. Robert Alter uses the terms historicized prose fiction and fictionalized history to describe the Hebrew Bible in general, not just the Deuteronomistic history, but the Hebrew Bible in general. And again, this doesn't mean that there are no historical facts embedded in the text. There most certainly are. But the terms historicized prose fiction and fictionalized history serve to remind us that we are somewhere between history in the modern sense, what modern scholars and readers think of when they think of history, an account of what really happened as objectively as possible, and we're between that and what we moderns would categorize as fiction. We're somewhere in the realm of, well, a historical novel or a film about events of history that invents characters or at least puts conversations that we don't have any knowledge of into the mouth of historical figures. Alter compares the writers of the David stories in particular to Shakespeare in his history plays, and I find this a very, very useful, very fruitful comparison. He says, quote, "The author of the David stories stands in basically the same relation to Israelite history as Shakespeare stands to English history in his history plays. Shakespeare was obviously not free to have Henry V lose the Battle of Agincourt, or to allow someone else to lead the English forces there. But working from the hints of historical tradition, he could invent a kind of Bildungsroman, that's a German term that means formation novel, a novel about a young man's development. He could invent a kind of Bildungsroman for the young Prince Hal, surround him with invented characters that would serve as foils, mirrors, obstacles, aids in his development, create a language and psychology for the king which are the writer's own achievement, making out of the stuff of history a powerful projection of human possibility. That is essentially what the author of the David cycle does for David, Saul, Abner, Jonathan, Abigail, and a host of other characters, close quote. As I say, I find that a very, very useful comparison. The given facts of the tradition are there. We know who David was, what he did, when he did it. But the author of the David stories creates the characterizations and the focus of the stories, just as Shakespeare did in his history plays. A similar comparison, of course, can be made with Homer's relationship to his material, using Homer as a shorthand for the whole tradition that formed the Iliad and the Odyssey, as I described in the first lecture. And we'll return to these issues of the nature of history and the exact interplay between historiography and free invention at the beginning of part 2 of this course, when we discuss Herodotus and Thucydides, the Greek historians, and their relationship to their material. But back to the Deuteronomistic history. The recognition that this is a literary work compiled and arranged with an overarching take on monarchy and on God's hand in history has many, I think, very important implications for our understanding of what it tells us about the monarchy and of the roles of the most famous kings. And just as I did in the previous lecture when I chose the creation stories to focus in on some of the aspects of the documentary hypothesis, here I want to look in some detail at the story that I think most people choose when they're doing this kind of presentation on the Deuteronomistic history. I want to look at the story of David and Bathsheba and talk about what we're told about David there, how this king is presented, and what the implications of that may be for our understanding of what's going on in the text. This story appears in 2 Samuel chapters 11 through 12. And the picture that we are given of David, the great King David, in this part of his story is very far from an admirable one. To begin with, David is acting in direct contradiction of a king's military duty. Remember, the people said to Samuel, we want a king to lead us in battle like kings lead other nations. Well, when this story, this episode in David's story opens, David is idle at home while his troops are off at war. So he's failed in this military aspect of a king's duty. He's not leading his troops into battle. In direct contradiction of a king's civic duty, David seduces at best the wife of one of his soldiers and then arranges to have that soldier killed. Now, I say seduces at best because the woman in question, of course, is Bathsheba, and we're never told whether she is a willing participant in her adultery with David or not. But how willing could she be, or rather, how unwilling could she be? If the king sends a message saying, I want you to come sleep with me, what is a citizen woman supposed to do? How can she refuse? So, at the best, David seduces a married woman. At the worst, we could see this as a kind of rape. Bathsheba is married to Uriah the Hittite, a soldier in David's army. David sees her bathing on the roof of her house and summons her to come to him. And we're not told what Bathsheba thinks or what she wants. She's not given really any voice in the story at all. The only time she speaks in any way in this story is when she sends a message to David to tell him that she's pregnant. He sends for her, they sleep together, she gets pregnant, and she sends him a message saying that she is carrying his child. Now, once again, David does not show up in the most admirable of lights. His first reaction to Bathsheba's news is to try to palm the child off as her husband's. He sends for Uriah the Hittite to come back from the battlefield and tells Uriah, go home and visit your wife. Now, obviously, David is assuming that if Uriah goes home, he and Bathsheba will sleep together, and the pregnancy is early enough that when the child's born, it will be reasonable for people to assume that it's Uriah's, and so Nice cover story, it'll work. However, Uriah honors a tradition that a soldier consecrated for battle should not engage in sexual relations, and so he doesn't even go home. He doesn't visit Bathsheba at all. Rather than put himself in the way of temptation to sleep with her, he simply doesn't visit her. So, that doesn't work. The child cannot be palmed off as Uriah's. David then gives orders that Uriah be placed in the front line of battle, and Uriah is killed, as David intends for him to be. So this great king has just committed adultery, if not rape, and then has murdered the husband of the woman he seduced. Now, it could be worse. David does marry her. He could have just turned his back on her entirely, cast her off, let her be stoned as an adulteress, whatever. He doesn't do that. He does, after Uriah dies, David does marry Bathsheba. So it could, as I say, be worse, but it's still, any way you cut it, a fairly unsavory story. And we're told in 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 27, that the Lord is displeased by the thing David had done. And the Lord expresses his displeasure by sending a prophet, Nathan, to rebuke David. As I said before, I'll come back in the next lecture to talking about prophecy and how prophecy works, who and what a prophet is. But for right now, suffice it to say that the prophet Nathan serves as a spokesman for the Lord, comes to David, and makes David realize his own guilt, his own culpability, through the use of a remarkable parable. Nathan tells the parable of the poor man with one ewe lamb, the man who owned only one lamb, one little female lamb that he loved and cherished and used to carry in his bosom and of which he was extremely fond. And then Nathan says a rich man who had many flocks took the poor man's one lamb away and slaughtered it. And he asks David, what would you think of a man who has done such a thing? David becomes very angry and says the rich man deserves death. Any man who would do such a terrible thing when he has all these flocks, David, by the way, has several wives, anyone who would do such a terrible thing as this when he has all these flocks to take away a poor man's one treasured lamb and slaughter it, that man deserves death. And Nathan responds with one of the most memorable lines in the Hebrew Bible. I'm going to quote the King James Version because I prefer it. "Thou art the man," he says. Wonderful line. And he then speaks in the name of the Lord, predicting evils to come in David's family. Nathan says, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel and rescued you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives, and gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have added as much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house, for you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, I will raise up trouble against you from within your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this very sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel." As strong rebukes go, that's about as strong as one can well imagine, and David admits his guilt. Nathan predicts that David himself will not die, but the baby Bathsheba is carrying will die because of David's transgression against the Lord by seducing Bathsheba and killing Uriah. Now, what can we make of a story like this about Israel's most famous king? And by the way, about a king who elsewhere in his story is indeed shown as admirable. This is the same David who as a young man kills Goliath. This is a man who in many ways is seen as the greatest or one of the greatest kings that Israel ever had. So what are we to make about this story in which he is at the very best an adulterer and a murderer, if not also a rapist? Well, there are several possibilities. Perhaps the tradition, the set stories, think again of the comparison with Shakespeare and the history plays, perhaps the tradition remembered that David had, in fact, seduced other men's wives, had, in fact, arranged for convenient deaths of husbands. And so this could not simply be left out. Perhaps the author had to include these stories. Maybe so. But the author could have tried to put a better gloss on these traditional elements by rearranging the order. For instance, if you have Uriah die in battle before David and Bathsheba get together, then suddenly the story becomes fine. Yes, her husband died in battle. Yes, David married her and they had a child together, or their first child died. Their second child, of course, was Solomon. But the author, far from trying to do that, far from trying to explain away David's transgressions, puts them front and center and draws our attention to them, foregrounds it. Again, Nathan's rebuke is one of the strongest and most memorable passages in the text. Maybe the author is, among other things, concerned to remind us that the legitimacy of the king did not depend on his own ethical behavior. David is God's anointed, but even he is fallible and at times evil. And maybe this is meant to remind us after the end of the monarchy. Remember, this text was compiled probably on into the time of and after the time of the Babylonian captivity. Perhaps after the end of the monarchy, one thing the text is trying to do is to remind us of the dangers inherent in rule even by a good king. To use the famous saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Even a good man elevated to a position of absolute power may fall into temptation to do this kind of thing. The only fully obvious thing is that the presentation of David and other kings, for that matter, in the Deuteronomistic history is very multifaceted, is far from simple in any way whatsoever. And once again, it's worth remembering that these books were written ex post facto, after the fall of the monarchy, probably not to explain what went right in the monarchy so much as to explain what went wrong. And so this text is meant not to glorify David, but to show us how David fell into error and the consequences that had. Now, the theological idea that runs throughout the Deuteronomistic history, that God rewards good behavior and punishes bad behavior, underlies a conception of the whole nature of good and bad fortune, the nature of justice in the world, which is often referred to as the Deuteronomistic theology, because it's a view of theology that is articulated one way or another throughout this section of the Bible. In this understanding of the nature of the world, good fortune is in itself evidence of righteousness. If you are doing well, you must be a righteous person. And conversely, bad fortune is seen in and of itself as evidence of sin. If something terrible happens to you, you must have done something to deserve it. We'll return to this view of the world, the Deuteronomistic theology, especially in Lecture 6 when we discuss Job, which is where this question is foregrounded, perhaps more than anywhere else in ancient literature. But under this understanding of the nature of the world, when the conquest of Judah by the Babylonians imposed calamity on the whole people, the question obviously arose, what have we done wrong? What have we done to deserve this? It cannot be that God has broken his half of the covenant and has let the Babylonians sack Jerusalem and take us into captivity when we haven't done anything to deserve that. He cannot have been unfaithful to the covenant. We must have been. What did we do wrong? And the Deuteronomistic history's presentation of the development of the monarchy is in part an attempt to answer this question. But it's not just sins of the monarchs. There's an implication in the Deuteronomistic history that the whole Israelite people also sinned or also went against the covenant. So according to the Deuteronomistic history, what did go wrong? Well, the most important transgression that comes up over and over again is that the people have this tendency to fall into idolatry, into worshiping other gods. Even Solomon is tempted by some of his foreign wives to give acknowledgement to those wives' native gods. So over and over again, there's the problem that the people tend to turn aside to other gods. Now, one fascinating point here that I touched on a bit earlier in the lecture, talking about the first commandment, thou shalt have no gods before me, is that the other gods are not denied or seen as meaningless or non-existent. The prohibition on having any other god before God, in other words, does not necessarily imply monotheism. In fact, if we read the covenant as being modeled on the suzerain vassal type of treaty, turning to other gods is seen as breaking the treaty's requirement of loyalty to one's overlord. That almost implies that there are other overlords out there to whom one could turn. And so The Deuteronomistic history in general does not yet seem to imply true monotheism. It implies instead a covenant between this God and this people, and the people's disobedience to that covenant. In the next lecture, we will return to discussing the latter prophets, and we'll focus in particular on the prophet Isaiah, and we'll see how in Isaiah true monotheism does come to be articulated in opposition to this pattern in the Deuteronomistic history.